The moment stretched long after the figure stilled, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do now that it knew I understood. The air felt different tonight, thicker, charged, like something unseen had shifted beneath the surface of the streets. Every sound seemed muted, every shadow stretched just a little too far, as though the city was rearranging itself in quiet anticipation. I took a single step forward, and the pressure in my mind tightened instantly, not painful, but unmistakably responsive, a silent acknowledgement that the connection between us hadn't faded with the night. The lamps overhead flickered in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the dim halos trembling as if reacting to my movement. And somewhere in the distance, deep within the city's maze of streets, I heard a low, resonant hum, a sound that didn't belong to any machine, but to something alive, something aware, something waiting. The figure didn't appear. It didn't need to. Its presence lingered in the air like a held note, pressing against the edges of my thoughts with a patience that felt far too deliberate to ignore. Whatever had awakened last night, it hadn't gone back to sleep. I took another step, and the hum in the distance shifted, not louder, but clearer, as if the city had adjusted its tone to acknowledge my movement. The air trembled with a faint vibration, a low, steady pulse that seemed to rise from the pavement itself. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't natural, it felt like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, echoing through the concrete beneath my feet. The lamps along the street flickered again, but this time the pattern wasn't random. Each light dimmed in sequence, one after another, rippling down the block like a signal being passed along. A quiet message, a warning, or an invitation. The pressure in my mind tightened, not painfully, but with a precision that made my breath catch. It felt like the figure's awareness brushing against my thoughts, testing the edges, learning the shape of my fear with a patience that bordered on intimate. Somewhere behind me, a soft metallic creak echoed through the silence, a sign the city was shifting again, rearranging itself in ways I couldn't see but could feel in the hollow of my chest. And in that moment, I realized the figure didn't need to appear for me to sense it. Its presence was threaded through the air, woven into the rhythm of the street, as if the city itself had become an extension of its awareness. Whatever had awakened wasn't confined to a single shape anymore. The hum beneath the pavement deepened, a low vibration that crawled up through my shoes and settled in the base of my spine. It wasn't random, it wasn't environmental, it felt like the city was adjusting itself around me, tuning its rhythm to match the presence I could no longer see but could feel in every breath. The lamps along the street flickered again, but this time they didn't dim in sequence. They dimmed in response, each one reacting a fraction of a second after my heartbeat, as if the city had learned the pattern and was echoing it back to me. A cold pressure brushed the edge of my thoughts, circling with a slow, deliberate curiosity, as though the figure was testing how close it could come without crossing whatever boundary kept it unseen. The sensation wasn't painful, but it carried a weight that made the air feel too thick to swallow. Somewhere to my left, a metal sign creaked softly, turning on its hinges even though there was no wind. The sound was small, but it carried through the silence like a signal, a quiet acknowledgement that the city was no longer acting on its own. The presence threaded through the air again, subtle but unmistakable, pressing against the edges of my awareness with a patience that felt almost practiced. It didn't need to reveal itself. It didn't need to speak. The city was speaking for it. The vibration beneath the pavement grew steadier, a slow, deliberate pulse that felt less like a sound and more like a signal being carried through the concrete. Each thrum settled into my bones, as if the city was syncing itself to the rhythm of my steps. A faint metallic groan echoed from somewhere above, followed by the soft rattle of a street sign turning on its hinges. There was no wind, no passing cars, nothing that should have moved it, but it shifted anyway, angling itself toward me as though the city wanted to make sure I saw it react. The lamps flickered again, but this time the light didn't just dim, it bent. The glow stretched toward the center of the street, pulling the shadows with it, gathering them into a shape that didn't quite form but didn't quite disappear either. The pressure in my mind tightened, a cold, deliberate presence brushing against my thoughts with a familiarity that made my breath catch. It felt like the figure was closer now, not physically, but threaded through the air around me, woven into the city's pulse. Like it had found a new way to exist. Somewhere behind me, a soft click echoed, a door unlatching itself, or a lock turning without a hand. The sound was small, but it carried through the silence with the weight of intention. The city wasn't just reacting anymore. It was participating, aligning itself with the presence I couldn't see but could feel in every breath, every flicker of light, every shift of shadow. Whatever had awakened wasn't alone. The hum beneath the pavement shifted again, dropping into a lower, slower rhythm that felt less like a vibration and more like a presence moving beneath the street. Not fast, not frantic, just steady, as if something was pacing below the surface, matching my breath, matching my hesitation. The lamps overhead flickered once, twice, then held the dim glow as the shadows around me stretched in a direction I hadn't been facing. They didn't stretch toward me. They stretched past me, as if pointing at something behind me that I hadn't realized was there. A cold pressure slid along the back of my thoughts, slow and deliberate, like a fingertip tracing the outline of a door it already knew how to open. The sensation tightened, not painful, but invasive in a way that made my chest lock. It felt like the figure was no longer testing the boundary, it was leaning against it. Somewhere to my right, a metal grate rattled softly, as though something beneath it had brushed against the bars. The sound was small, but it carried through the silence with a weight that made the hairs on my arms rise. The city wasn't just aligning itself anymore. It was directing me, subtle shifts in sound, in light, in pressure, all nudging me toward a place I hadn't chosen to go. And in that tightening stillness, I felt the presence settle closer, not revealing itself, not stepping forward, but pressing into the edges of my awareness with a certainty that made my breath tremble. Whatever had awakened, wanted me to follow. The hum beneath the pavement shifted again, dropping into a deeper, slower rhythm that felt less like the city breathing and more like something beneath it waking up. The shadows along the street thickened, pulling away from the lamps as if the light no longer had the strength to hold them back. They gathered near the curb, pulling in shapes that didn't stay still, shapes that twitched, stretched, and folded in on themselves like they were trying to decide what form to take. A cold pressure slid across the back of my mind, sharper this time, more focused, as though the figure was no longer content to linger at the edges. It pressed closer, leaning into my thoughts with a curiosity that felt almost predatory. Something shifted in the darkness ahead, a soft scrape, like claws dragging lightly across concrete, though nothing stepped into the light. The sound was small, but it carried through the silence with a weight that made my breath catch. The shadows near the curb twitched again, stretching upward for a moment, forming the faint outline of something too tall, too thin, too wrong to belong to any living thing I knew. It didn't hold the shape for long, just long enough for me to understand that the figure wasn't alone anymore. The pressure in my mind tightened, a cold, deliberate pull that felt like the figure was guiding my attention, showing me what it wanted me to see. Not attacking, not revealing itself fully, just letting me know that whatever was forming in the shadows was connected to it. And in that suffocating stillness, I realized the city wasn't just reacting to the figure's presence. It was helping it, shaping the darkness around it, giving it room to become whatever it was becoming. The shadows near the curb twitched again, but this time they didn't collapse back into the pavement. They rose, slowly, unevenly, as if pulled upward by invisible strings. The shapes were thin, too thin, stretching into narrow silhouettes that swayed like they were learning how to stand. A cold pulse slid through my thoughts, sharper than before, and I knew it wasn't the city doing this. It was the figure, its awareness pressing closer, guiding the shadows into forms that shouldn't have been able to move at all. One of the shapes stepped forward. Not a full step, just a shift, a dragging motion that scraped softly across the concrete like something testing the idea of walking. The sound was small, but it carried through the silence with a weight that made my breath lock in my chest. The lamps overhead flickered violently, the dim halos trembling as the shadows stretched toward me, reaching with long, uneven limbs that bent at angles no body should have. They didn't touch me, they didn't need to, their presence alone felt like a cold hand hovering just above my skin. The pressure in my mind tightened again, a deliberate pull that felt like the figure was drawing closer through the creatures it had shaped. Not revealing itself, not stepping into the light, but letting me feel its attention through every twitch of shadow, every scrape of movement, every breath of cold air that brushed my neck. The creatures didn't have faces. They didn't need them, their awareness came from somewhere else. Threaded through the air, woven into the city's pulse, guided by the figure's presence like extensions of its will. And as they inched closer, slow and uneven, I realized the figure wasn't just watching anymore. It was reaching. The creatures didn't stay at the curb this time. They leaned forward, slow, jerky motions, as if their limbs were remembering how to move after being shadows for too long. One of them lifted its head, or what should have been a head, a long, narrow shape that stretched upward until it hovered just above my eye level. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, but the space where a face should have been tilted toward me with a focus that felt far too direct. The pressure in my mind tightened instantly, a cold, deliberate push that made my breath stutter. It felt like the figure was right behind the creature, leaning through it, using it, pressing its awareness forward until it hovered inches from my thoughts. Another shape dragged itself closer, its limbs bending in slow, unnatural angles as it pulled its body toward me. The scraping sound it made echoed through the empty street like a whisper meant only for me. The lamps above flickered violently, the dim halos shrinking as the creatures stepped into the thin strands of light. The glow clung to them for a moment, then slid off their forms as if the light itself refused to stay on them. One of the creatures leaned in, close enough that I could feel the cold of its presence brush against my cheek. It didn't touch me. It didn't need to. The air between us felt thin, fragile, as if one more breath would let it slip inside the space I was trying to hold. The pressure in my mind pulsed again, sharper this time, and I felt the figure's awareness push forward through the creatures, through the shadows, through the city itself, until it hovered right in front of me without ever taking a shape. The creatures weren't approaching on their own. They were being guided, directed, placed in front of me like the figure wanted me to understand just how close it could get without ever stepping into the light. The creature closest to me tilted its head again, a slow, unnatural bend that brought the blank stretch of its face inches from mine. There were no eyes, but I felt watched, felt its attention lock onto me with a precision that made my breath catch. The pressure in my mind pulsed sharply, and the creature reacted instantly, leaning closer as if the figure's awareness had pushed through it, using its shape to get nearer than it ever had before. Another creature dragged itself forward, its limbs scraping across the pavement in a rhythm that matched the tremor in my chest. Every time my heartbeat stuttered, its movement stuttered with it, as if it was syncing itself to me, learning the pattern of my fear. The lamps above flickered violently, the dim halos shrinking until the creatures stood half-lit, their forms trembling at the edges like they were struggling to stay solid. But they didn't pull back. They leaned in, closer, closer, until the cold of their presence pressed against my skin like a breath that didn't belong to anything living. One of them lifted an arm, a long, narrow limb that bent too many times, and reached toward my face. It stopped just short of touching me, hovering in the thin space between us as if waiting for permission it already knew I wouldn't give. The pressure in my mind tightened again, a cold, deliberate squeeze that made the air feel too thin to swallow. The creatures reacted instantly, their heads snapping toward me in perfect unison, as though the figure had whispered something directly into their formless thoughts. They weren't just approaching anymore, they were responding, mirroring, closing in around me with a precision that felt rehearsed, as if they'd been waiting for this moment long before I ever stepped into the street. The creatures didn't just lean in this time. They closed the remaining distance in a slow, deliberate crawl, their limbs bending in sharp, unnatural angles as they formed a loose circle around me. Not touching, but close enough that the cold of their presence pressed against my skin from every direction. The one nearest my face tilted its head again, a long, trembling motion that brought the blank stretch of its face so close I could feel the air shift with its movement. There were no features, but the attention radiating from it felt unmistakably direct, like it was studying the shape of my fear from inches away. The pressure in my mind pulsed hard, a cold, deliberate shove that made my breath hitch. The creatures reacted instantly, their heads snapping toward me in perfect unison, as though the figure had pushed its awareness straight through them. One of them dragged a limb across the pavement, a slow, scraping motion that matched the tremor in my chest. Every time my breath stuttered, its movement stuttered with it, mirroring me, syncing with me, closing in on the rhythm of my fear as if learning it. The lamps above flickered violently, the dim halos shrinking until the creatures stood half-lit, their forms trembling at the edges like they were struggling to stay solid. But they didn't pull back. They leaned closer, so close the cold of their presence felt like it was seeping into my bones. Another creature rose behind me, its long, narrow form stretching upward until it hovered just over my shoulder. I didn't hear it move. I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature that brushed the back of my neck like a breath that didn't belong to anything living. The pressure in my mind tightened again, sharper, closer, as if the figure itself was pressing forward through the creatures, using him as a doorway to get nearer than it ever had before. The circle tightened, the air thinned, and for the first time, I felt the presence not just around me, but right in front of me, hovering in the space where my next breath was supposed to be. The air shifted before anything moved. A sudden, heavy pressure pressed against the back of my thoughts, so sharp and deliberate it felt like the figure was trying to step forward through the space inside my mind. The creatures reacted instantly, their heads snapped upward, their long, narrow forms trembling as if something behind them was pushing through their shapes. The shadows around their bodies rippled, stretching outward in thin, jagged lines that flickered like broken reflections. One of them lurched closer, its faceless head stopping just inches from mine. The air between us thinned, tightened, as if the figure's awareness was pressing through it, trying to see me more clearly through the creature's form. Another shape rose behind me, so close I felt the cold of its presence brush the back of my neck. It didn't breathe, but the space around it pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the pressure building in my mind. The lamps overhead flickered violently, the dim halos shrinking until the creatures stood in a trembling half-light. Their limbs bent inward, as though something inside them was pulling the shapes apart from the inside out. The pressure in my mind tightened again, a cold, invasive push that made the edges of my vision blur. The creatures reacted instantly, their bodies twisting, leaning toward me as if the figure was trying to step through them, using their forms as a doorway to get closer than it ever had before. The circle closed in, the air thinned, and for a moment, I felt the presence not just around me, not just in front of me, but pressing through the creatures, trying to manifest in the space where I was standing. The air tightened around me, as if the space itself was shrinking, pulled inward by the presence pressing through the creatures. Their bodies trembled in the half-light, shadows rippling across their forms like something inside them was trying to push its way out. One of them leaned so close the cold of its presence brushed my cheek, a thin, icy pressure that made my breath catch in my throat. Its faceless head hovered inches from mine, tilting slowly, as if listening to the sound of my fear. The pressure in my mind pulsed again, sharper this time, and the creatures reacted instantly, their limbs twitching, their heads snapping toward me with a precision that felt rehearsed. It was as if the figure was using them to test how close it could get without crossing whatever boundary held it back. Another shape rose behind me, so close I felt the cold of its presence slide down the back of my neck like a breath that didn't belong to anything living. The lamps flickered violently, the dim halos shrinking until the creatures stood in a trembling ring of half-light, leaning in, closing the circle, waiting for the figure's next move. And in that suffocating stillness, I felt the presence press forward again, not around me, not through the street, but directly toward the space where my next breath was supposed to be.